Well, good morning, Kepler families. I am here today with Ed Straka, one of our humanities teachers. He has a slew of courses that you see scrolling across the bottom of your screen, covering worldview, politics, history. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Ed, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here, John.
So, before we get rolling on just the cornucopia, the plethora, and other such synonyms for plenty of the material in your courses, I wonder if we could. I just want to get to know you. Sir Francis Drake and Japan and exotic locations like Wisconsin come up in your biography. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about you, who you are, and what you're up to.
All right. Well, I am Ed Straka, and I currently live in Texas and out here in the country. Been here 7 years, taught at a classical Christian school locally for about 7 years, and for 7 years, and transitioning into Kepler and some other things. I've been involved in education for over 30 years. Actually began in Asia over 30 years ago as an English teacher, and I seem to enjoy that, and began to pursue more education and get back into it in time. And basically, probably from my early 20s onward, just began to study a lot of things on my own, had a variety of interests, and because of my time overseas, obviously got into Asiatic studies, religious, philosophical, historical, and cultural, and then come back to the States and study more. And so I'm pretty much interested in everything.
Well, I think one of the things that happens with people who are interested in everything is they often express it through writing, and particularly through fiction. You have a lot of imaginative fiction under your belt. So I feel bad as an interviewer because I have an author here, and I haven't read his fiction. Of course, you're here in your capacity as a teacher, but in glancing through some of these titles, a lot of them are dystopian. Are they science fiction? Are they alternative reality? There seems to be kind of a cyberpunk edge to some of the stuff you're writing.
With the last fiction work I did, When the World Went Dark, it's definitely dystopian, futuristic, deals with a lot of bioethical issues, and it's set in Asia. I kind of pulled in a variety of things, bioethics, the vast changes that I saw happening over the decades in terms of power, the acquisition of power by nation states, the maintenance of it, and the projecting of it, and how a lot of big ideas go wrong. And in some respects, we could say we seem to be tilting towards something like that right now, and what will be on the other side of it. And so with When the World Went Dark, definitely futuristic and dealing with a lot of big questions that, at least from the Judeo-Christian standpoint, people deal with. And the other two novels, the Harbor City series, those are actually historical fiction taking place in Asia in general and in the China, Hong Kong, Vietnam era in particular. And having lived out there for many years, it was just an interest in me. Plus, when you're my age, I lived through a lot of that stuff. So,
right. Well, yeah, and I noticed with some of your nonfiction, it seems like a lot of what you've lived through has influenced some of your research and writing. And so I wanted to get into that as well shortly. But before we do that, let's actually. I want to. It seems like a lot of certainly the work you've put into your classes and in planning your classes is informed by what you start your teaching philosophy with, which is that the position we must embrace regarding Christian education is the understanding that man, first and foremost, is God's vice regent / steward on earth. And I found the use of the term vice regent particularly interesting. Could you open that up a little bit for us?
Sure. It's a term that in modern Christendom we don't seem to use that much anymore, but was one that was used quite a bit during the Reformation and even before. The idea of vice meaning sub and regent meaning ruler. If it's the case that the scriptures of the Old and New Testament are true, and of course we believe that they are, when you ask the question, what is man? You have to go to scripture and find out, well, where did man begin? How did he begin? What was his purpose? In other words, all things, even Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, knew all things have a purpose intrinsically within them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, with modern evangelicalism, they seem to think that because of sin, somehow man is no longer in his position of vice regent. And that's not true. The only change with sin is that man has a propensity to exercise his regency, his dominion covenant or creation mandate, if you will, lawlessly, right? And so all people, men and women, even boys and girls in terms of how they take care of their own bedroom, right? All people are regents, right? All people are stewards. All people have something they have to take responsibility for. And the only thing that separates people essentially is, whether they are theists or atheists. Do they think they're home alone and can do whatever they want? Or do they think they're responsible to someone, a higher power, a being, and so forth, right? And historic Christianity believed that sin just made man's dominion assignment more difficult because he lived in a fallen world that was going to push back against him. I know we live in Texas, so we have scorpions and rattlesnakes and you name it, as well as all kinds of sharp weeds and all of that, right? The ground is cursed, as scripture says it is. We have our own sin we have to deal with and repent of. We have to work through the sins of other people. Some people will repent, some people will not. And some people, as of late we unfortunately know, are very violent in that. And they make the dominion of God's earth difficult, the stewardship of it difficult. So that's my perspective. The dominion covenant didn't go away. We know that because after the flood, Noah's given the exact same instructions that Adam and Eve were in Genesis chapter 9. So it just continues on. The parable of the talents that Jesus gives, right? St. Paul, a lot of his writings, do work with your own hands. If a man doth not work, he shall not eat. In the Psalms, Moses, bless thou, O Lord, the work of our hands. So, work is not a punishment. Work is a blessing given by God that was there originally. Sin just makes it more difficult. It doesn't negate it.
Right. The curse is having to work through the curse, through the difficulties brought on. Right. It's not the work itself. Well, it's I find it really interesting that you approached this, talking about responsibility through the word purpose. Because one thing that surprised me as I was reading, so you have this course, Mongols, the rise of a medieval superpower. And immediately with the use of the term superpower, we kind of realize this is probably a geopolitical history. And reading the description of the course, so yeah, it's a geopolitical history. And then the first word in course objectives is telos. And, I found that quite interesting. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yeah, the word telos is a Greek word. It means ultimate end or goal or purpose. In other words, an intentionality, right? And in my mind, all things that God have created have intrinsically within it a purpose, an end, a goal, right? Birds, bees, trees, grass, they have a telos within them. It's not conscious like a human being's, but it nonetheless is there. And human beings have a telos, right? And with regard to the Mongols, their telos was to conquer the world. Mm-hmm. They came pretty close to it. And yet very few people know about it. It's so amazing.
Yes. Well, and it's fascinating, and I think this would be something that students should really look forward to in that course, is exploring how half the world is interacting with them. Whether you're talking about Hungarian kings or Persian city-states, or or the Middle Kingdom, and or China, right? This all of these interactions and all of this documentation, all of this terror. And it's across half of the globe. So it's actually a wonderful opportunity to study global history during a certain period as well.
Exactly. In my medieval classes where I've taught, part of the classical literature, of course, during medieval time, we not only read The Prince by Machiavelli and, of course, the Divine Comedy by Dante, the famous Inferno, but we also read Marco Polo. And Marco Polo, of course, takes us from that era of essentially kind of on the hinge of the 12th century pan-European Renaissance in all areas to the 4th century Italian Renaissance, right? And he heads out to the Far East with his father and his uncle, and ends up in the court of Kublai Khan, who, of course, is the grandson of the great Genghis Khan, right? And so it ties together a world that most Westerners know very, very little about, right? And the rise of the one of the greatest generals that ever lived, Genghis Khan, who in 25 years, his empire was the same size, if not larger, than what took the Romans 400 years to build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. That's a course I think that a lot of young people could, will get really excited about. There are some courses that are just like, we as teachers know you need this and you will rejoice in the fruit of it. Then there are other courses where it's like, we know the students will be like, sweet. And I think that course is one of them. Some of your work, you have two titles listed in your publications, which use the term natural order in city planning, and natural order and the return of independent city states. And so, in thinking about how you're applying natural order here, I mean, are you using it as natural law? Does this touch on what you were just telling us about creation mandate? What do you mean when you say natural order? Because I think there might be, when just with that phrase by itself, the potential pushback is to say the world is chaotic, that the world is entropic, but so is natural order a big term for you, or are you applying it very narrowly?
In some respects, it's a big term because in context of the creation mandates, okay, if it's the case, God exists, therefore, what is a human being? What does it tell us of the human being, and so forth? And what type of societies do human beings best function in, right? And so I do dub that tail in with the idea of natural law, the law of nations, right? Mm-hmm. Most people, most of the time, choose to live inside family units. They have daily responsibilities of stewardship and care and so forth. And, the idea that family units are the primary unit. Family units to survive interact with other family units. They're able to do so best, I think, when they are able to locally control their affairs, right? It's interesting, if you go back to even the ancient philosophers of Plato, of course, first, and then Aristotle, they warned against the size of cities and said that the larger it is, the less people know one another, and the potential for the acquisition of great power, not only over the people, the citizenry, but also against neighboring city-states or free states, if you will. I think for whatever reason, Plato had some type of numeric figure of, 5,600 and something, that a city should never be bigger than that. With Aristotle, he believed that if you were to, stand in an open field and were to spin around slowly, the amount of people that you can see standing right there only should be the size of that city. Augustine in the City of God says that which is large cannot be governed well. And of course Aquinas is the great synthesizer of Aristotelian philosophy and law, and the concept of natural law, the common good, right? And spoke a lot about order and so forth. And even in the writings of St. Augustine, the City of God, he talks about the different things that were written by Cicero a long time ago in Res Publica, and the idea of people working in harmony together. And that whole concept of locality, subsidiarity, mutual working together, as opposed to having your life and your well-being determined by someone who lives 1,000 or 2,000 miles away, right? And so I think there's a natural order wherein people, if they are allowed to pursue their dominion assignment, okay, in a lawful fashion, that the most talented, the most foresighted, the most hardworking, they will naturally rise to the top, and you can produce a society that is mutually beneficial, right? And if you of course have to base that on a justice system where everyone receives their due, right? And if you can be protected from criminals, whether local or governmental, people are able to live a flourishing life. So that's essentially it. I believe in decentralization, locality, local government and so forth. Probably I would say in terms of the Habsburg Empire, when you had the Holy Roman Empire and you looked at Central Europe, you had free states, free cities, city-states, duchies, dukedoms, smaller kingdoms, and so forth. And they were all a hodgepodge, okay? And maybe they were underneath the Holy Roman Emperor, but it was decentralized. They have local rule and so forth. So I believe in that. I believe in concepts of natural law, right? Property is good. You have to steward it to fulfill your dominion assignment. Families are good. Childbirth is good. Your hand out of my pocket, my hand out of your pocket. These are good things, right? And the idea of human beings being encouraged in the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge and so forth.
Now, you talk about the return of the independent city-state, and so you value decentralization and local government. Do you believe, thinking from a perspective of natural order, do you believe that there's a natural tendency toward decentralization, or is this something that we need to strive for?
I believe if human beings are left alone, there is a natural tendency toward that. I mean, if nothing else, the last 3,500 years, all empires eventually collapse, right? To me, there's like 3 steps, to the destruction of a civilization. You begin as a small commonwealth, a colony, what the Greeks called the polis and the Romans called the Earps, and local free cities, city-states, and so on and so forth. And they grow to commonwealth. And in time, for whatever reason, they may grow into nations, maybe small nations, maybe fairly large. But then there's some type of internal crisis, and they have to make up their minds and make decisions in terms of how they're going to solve those problems. And if they're successful, the nation continues on, right? And if not, then they collapse down and maybe are absorbed by someone else. But sometimes their crisis comes externally. They have problems with a neighbor, maybe land border neighbor, or maybe someone across the sea or an ocean. And so they have to decide how they're going to solve that problem, right? And unfortunately, sometimes there's that idea, well, while we're fighting them here, we'll go around and land on their territory. And it's a successful military strategy. The problem is maybe the army doesn't go home and they decide to stay, right? And then you have this step-by-step, all at once tendency toward empire and the maintaining of it. And the more you spread out from that original local vision and the core moral values that it was based upon, those people begin to turn away from their core values, faith, family, freedom, social responsibility, because to maintain a large geographic area under a power structure, you have to change your values to do that, because if nothing else, you're controlling other people who have different values, a different cultural system, different folkways, right? And so once you start doing that, it's only a matter of time, financially, philosophically, just in terms of human life, the cost becomes too great. And then you have that forced decentralization. Some nations are able to survive that decentralization and maintain the integrity of their nation state, their culture, right? But some of them, after such a thing, are totally shattered. I mean, after Alexander the Great, there was nothing left, right?
Right.
And that's happened many times in history, where suddenly it's just over. 476, when the Vandals took Rome, that was it. And
No.
I think where America's going now, we have internal stresses, obviously, as well as external. And I think we're going to see a decentralization that, in many respects, initially is going to be very unpleasant. But I think long term, Lord willing, at least in some places in North America, it may be quite pleasant.
Mm. Yeah, the ancient curse of may you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
We may just be living in interesting times. So
Yes,
with Brexit and with many other tendencies that we're seeing now, do you believe we're entering a phase of history in which things become decentralized, or is this just a blip on the radar?
I think more and more we're going to see a decentralization, and because there are too many nations on both sides of the Pacific and the Atlantic that have internal stresses within their nation, but equally in terms of on their borders. And let's be honest, military conflict of any type, soft power, hard power, that all costs time, money, and effort and blood to maintain. And as the world economic system gets weaker, particularly here in the West, due to hyperinflation and so forth, it's going to be difficult to maintain, all of that international control.
Yes.
And then with our own economy, the COVID lockdowns, the further destruction of the American economy, the attempt to inflate our way out of that. You have a lot of people who are feeling very disenfranchised over that and mistrust the government because of that. And then just locally, everything that's happened in the last 3 weeks with all the rioting, the burning, the lack of police support and so forth. I think people more and more are beginning to realize, ultimately it's up to people locally to take care of ourselves. And the whole idea that we're going to, every 4 years, we're going to pull a lever for a certain political figure who's going to make everything well. I think, there's two, we no longer have those core values, right, as a nation. And even people who profess Christ don't agree on social, political, economic systems anymore. And the whole idea we're going to force people to this and that, that's not going to happen, and whether it's the left or the right or the moderates in between. And I think if things continue to spiral downward, it's going to be more difficult for the power structures to respond. And I think you will see a rise of localism. I think we already are seeing it.
Yes.
Just the different responses to the COVID lockdowns nationally, where some cities and governments said, no, we're not forcing people to wear masks and stay home. Some cities have allowed themselves to be, burned down and pillaged by the rioters. Other cities and towns have said, nope, not happening here. So again, there's a different perspective. And I remember 20 years ago after 9/11, and united we stand. And I was thinking, well, not really. We're united by a geographic location. by the color of money, at least while it's not electronic, and an April 15th tax bill. But beyond that, there's very little unity anymore. And it's nothing new. If you read through history, it's happened before. America's not sacrosanct, and at the time of the civilization's zenith, it's like it's that last gasp toward greatness before it all just spirals down. And I think that's where we're at now.
Anyway, and that's probably some of the inspiration for your course, United We Fall: How Bad Ideas Destroy America. Now, you've made something of a study of China, and so in thinking about this the decentralization and the tensions within all the traditional superpowers, it seems to me like if we think about the traditional superpowers, the European bloc, the United States, that the powers that have the least internal tensions are Russia and China, particularly China, and of course they have tensions as far as tensions with Japan and Southeast Asia and their sea tensions in the West with certain people groups. Nonetheless, they seem to have the fewest internal pressures. Do you see the rise of China as a power because of the tensions within the other traditional superpowers?
Yes, I do. The one thing that the public school system did here in America was basically dumb people down. And people don't think logically anymore in terms of just social political theory. Everything is agenda based. We really don't teach economics anymore. I mean, let's be honest. If you and I take our credit cards and jack them up, we can then go out and get other credit cards and maybe take money from there, right? But eventually a bank is going to say no, right? And then we're going to be forced to service the debt one way or another or declare bankruptcy, okay? And the only difference between us and the federal government is the number of zeros, right? People, families, businesses, nations go bankrupt step by step and all at once. And when America went off, the gold standard, well over 50, 60 years ago, and then eventually in the 60s went off the silver standard, you had nothing that the money was tagged to anymore, right? And so it became monopoly money, right? If you and I, with our high-tech computers and printing presses, were to start printing money, we'd be called counterfeiters and be put in jail because the money's not based on anything. But the Federal Reserve has a monopoly on that, right? And so they can print exponentially. I mean, we just saw it this spring with a $2+ trillion. I don't think people realize how much that is and the possibility of paying that back, right? Well, the thing is, China, many other countries have been buying gold for decades, right? And the whole thing with that BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America, South Africa economic bloc, they've been doing the same thing as an alternative to the US dollar as the reserve currency and the basis of petrodollars. Some people in the Middle East, including, Gaddafi, of course, who's dead, it was said he was trying to get a move in the Middle East to bring up the gold denarii and have that be the base money system in the Middle East and so forth, right? So you have other nations that are pushing back against the Anglo-American, power block, as it were. And, they have a lot of people. You have 1.5 billion people in China, and then there's the overseas Chinese community. You have Russia, who is 10 or 11 time zones. They don't have a big population, but they do have a powerful military. I don't think they're going to invade anyone. They don't have enough people. They have enough problems there, but they're not going to be invaded easily either.
No. Anyway, having a powerful military in itself has an effect. Daniel Fukushon actually asks your opinion about the American currency. He says that it's backed by the American military for good or ill. So whatever strength the American dollar has exists because of our military might. Do you agree with that?
Unfortunately, yes. There's soft power manipulation via media, business deals, even misinformation and disinformation that America uses to influence, and I'll even say control other societies and nations. But if push comes to shove, I think if people don't play nice, we will use hard power, either through black ops or outright military intervention, or maybe the withholding of military intervention if someone doesn't want to make the deal. Most people, I think, don't realize after the American military is set in motion, there's different international conglomerates that always follow our military and set up shop and make billions of dollars. And, the first time I heard that, Joff, I think it was like 40 years ago, and I heard it from a Marxist, and it's just like, oh, you're just saying that. But, one thing I learned, I'm in my 60s now, is you can learn a lot about yourself by listening to your enemies, right? And so when I began to research and say, are these things true? Not, is Marxism true? It's not. It's false. It destroys everything it touches, right? But a lot of their accusations are, in fact, accurate.
Right.
And, there are unfortunate things that go on, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so, yeah, I do believe that. I do believe. I mean, if you have 800 or 900 military bases overseas,
right,
you're an empire. The legions are abroad.
And that actually kind of is leading to my next question, because we talk about using military might to back our currency, and we've also been talking about decentralization and a lot of the internal pressures that we're undergoing. It seems like we're at a pivot where we could become, the United States, could become more consciously an empire, or where things could actually fall apart for good or ill, but become decentralized. So that kind of leads to Scott Postma's question: what response from the current culture could turn America around and revive its viability as a free nation? And this sort of touches on the united we fall, how bad ideas destroy America class, as well as your politics and social theory, which is much more of a macro class. So what response would the current American culture need to show to revive a free nation?
Oh goodness, that's a great question. How like Scott to ask one like that.
Yeah.
You almost want to say, turn off the media, right? Turn off the media, so people are forced to look locally and say, what problems do we have here? Unfortunately, so much of the media now is controlling people's thoughts and actions, and
that includes social media.
It really does. And the questions are too narrow, right? I mean, again, the concept of justice. What is justice? Historically, for thousands of years, justice is when everyone gets their due, right? If you're a law-abiding person and you're not making trouble, the due of your justice is you're left alone. If you cause trouble, if you take away other people's freedom, whether it's freedom just to drive into town and go shopping, okay, you're a lawbreaker. If you destroy people's property, public, private, you're a lawbreaker. If you hurt people, you're a lawbreaker, okay? Where now justice is, well, that society is unjust because of whatever. Or now the new phenomenon of people, asking other people to, apologize because they're of this race or another. I mean, you apologize in context of a moral scenario where you either have good actions or bad actions. If I apologize, it assumes I've done something wrong based on a moral system. Well, a person being born white, black, yellow, red, or brown hasn't done anything right or wrong because they didn't choose to be born, much less the ethnic background of their family, right? But A lot of people don't understand that because they've been so brainwashed, that
Well, let
guilt is no
me.
longer attached to a moral system, right? Because people don't think morally. They don't think based upon intrinsic, moral systems. Again, the idea of natural law that we discussed earlier, that goes on in all nations, where whatever nation you're in, if you commit acts of violence or theft or destruction, most people, most of the time, and most societies say that's wrong. You don't have the privilege to do that. And I think until there's a revival of intrinsic principles like that, I don't think things will change. I think most people have been dumbed down to the point that, whatever they hear, they'll just go along with. It's like their brains are shut off.
Well, that like the idea of inflation, for example, we talked about, the recent injection, and we're basically just inventing money at this point. You have to either have experienced the negative effects of that, or be studying. But when I was a kid, when we left Brazil, inflation was at an absurd level. It was 80% the month we left, and it got worse.
Yeah.
And, so the prudent financial behavior at that time was to spend all your money as soon as you got paid. And bosses would try to pay you at the end of the day, because what they were paying out would be worth less than if they were paying at the beginning of the day. So the specter of that kind of thing is more than a specter in some places, but Americans have never confronted that. And so, it basically just becomes all theoretical for us, but we allow the theory to be just, propaganda and memes and headlines, instead of actually being something that we study seriously. And that's the value for students and for Kepler students in studying such things. You talked about lawbreakers a good bit. So here's a question for you that will sound familiar to you. It's familiar to you because you teach on this question for an entire semester. How can the individual be granted maximum freedom, yet be controlled by the rule of law for the good of society? The Socratic problem. So I'll just repeat it for the audience. How can the individual be granted maximum freedom, yet be controlled by the rule of law for the good of society? Can you give us a thumbnail answer, since we don't have a semester for this live?
Right. Again, the idea of natural law, the ancient Greeks and Romans spoke about it. And of course, the Christian philosophers and theologians did also, right? With Christianity, the last 2,000 years, of course, you had the 10 Commandments that were used formatively, to prepare a person to meet God. But, the philosophers and theologians, as time went on, realized you don't have a lot of people who are of the faith, so you can't make them believe something they don't. Mm-hmm. But what all people at all the time can agree on is the idea of a human being being important, having dignity, and being able to live unmolested, right? Their freedom not being taken away from them, their property not being stolen or destroyed, their body not being, it's like the idea of a tort. Someone has suffered a loss. Well, it's only when someone suffers a loss do you set the law in motion, right? And until those principles or ideas are received again, I think the average American is just a sitting duck for essentially whatever the politically correct new rage is, right? Only individuals can be held guilty of crimes, right? If I commit a crime, I'm responsible for it, not my children, not my grandchildren, not people of my ethnic group or religious group. I'm responsible, right? So you don't have multi-generational guilt, right? And so people need to rethink what it means to be a human, what it means to be a just human being, what it means to be responsible, and things like that. And I think natural law does that, because you can get most people to agree most of the time about the importance of freedom, right?
Well, and I love that you said be a human. because I feel like this conversation is moving in the direction of your course, Economics, the business of being human. And, you talk about, the freedom to work, to build up property. So, you have two books, I should say, by Thomas Sowell in here. Could you just kind of open up that class for our audience? Tell us about Economics, the business of being human, and in particular, maybe why you chose that title.
Right. That's based on an essay I actually wrote years ago, and I used it as an introduction to an economics class when I taught at a school in Mississippi. But then I began to use it at the beginning of all my classes to always reset the students toward the idea of a human being is created in the image of God, and therefore it has value. A human being, because it's created in the image of God, it has an intrinsic purpose that it's supposed to accomplish. And human beings either accomplish those purposes lawfully or not. And unfortunately, because human beings are fallen, human beings are sinful, even in the West, even amongst Christians, we have not always pursued our dominion under God in a lawful fashion. We've resorted to pragmatism and so forth. And, what separates a lawful dominion man from an unlawful dominion man or woman is their obedience to God's law, right? And the idea of, a contract. I'm going to do thus and such in a certain amount of time for a certain amount of money, so that having made the deal, both parties go away happy. Right? Yeah.
Well, and I love how as you're talking, you're integrating the concepts that seem to be that you're going to be unpacking in these classes. In one moment, you're talking about something that seems to have to do with the economics class, in another with the worldview class, and another with political and social theory. I imagine that the recitations in your courses are going to be quite interesting for our students. I wonder if we could close talking about your worldview class, which you have open to 11th and 12th graders only,
right.
Which makes me think that you have more than simply of course, none of our teachers have simply the passing of information on in mind as their highest goal, but that selection of age groups makes me think that you have a particular goal, a particular telos for this course. So could you unpack that class for us?
Sure. The worldview class, again, I'm basically stating that whatever a person believes about God, man, law, time, and hope is going to affect what they do in the family, the church, the state, or society. And what you do in the family, church, state, and society is going to determine what type of civilization you're able to build, right? I mean, that's one of the funny things about looking at Marxism, right, and democratic socialism. It's like, okay, you have these ideas, they sound great. Show me one civilization that was ever built and lasted on that. Right? And all worldviews, theistic or atheistic, have a certain perspective on God, man, law, time, and hope. And that's going to affect all their academic disciplines. And in the Worldview book that we'll be using, Understanding the Times, the authors basically set out, well, what is this person's worldview, right? Is it Judeo-Christian? Are they Muslims? Are they Marxists? Are they secular humanists, right? Are they postmodernists? All those religions, all those philosophies, they define their words very differently. They have a different perspective on family, on economics, on politics, on ethics, on law, even on science, the origin of a human being and the purpose of a human being. And so, ideas have consequences.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's very important. To me, it's like a capstone course. Before you graduate, you need to understand these are competing worldviews that, for better or worse, are in play in the world today.
Right. And this is not one of those worldview courses where you're becoming intimately familiar with a Christian worldview. It's that, but by taking on several other worldviews and engaging with them. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely.
So, I actually am going to post a comment here with a question with a term that I am not familiar with. So, feel free to do with this question what you like. But does Mr. Straka have any thoughts on integralism? So, yeah, I don't know what that is, but yeah, I'll just put that out there.
No, not really. But if you'd like to explain it, I'll consider
it. Okay, there you go. What an excellent answer. Well, we are kind of arriving at the end of our time. I appreciate everyone's interaction. Those of you who've been watching, you've been seeing Mr. Straka's classes scroll across the bottom. And one of the things that I've taken away from this conversation really is how, in talking to you, we can see how the themes that are unpacked in all of these courses are all integrated in your own mind. And so I think that all of these courses would be of great advantage to young men and women because the way you're unpacking them, at least for me, is very engaged with the world, very practical, without losing any of its philosophical integrity. So I wish you the best for this coming term. I wonder if you have any upcoming fiction publications coming out.
I'm hoping to do a part 2 of When the World Went Dark. I've actually started it a little bit last summer. I think I have about, 20, 25 pages written. Okay. And I also have a work that I started about 2 years ago about Panama, the nation by the Panama Canal. And so that'll be more of an action adventure thriller, kind of on the order of the Harbor City series. And so that's what I'm hoping to work on.
Okay. Yeah, well, you definitely have a lot going on. I saw in your profile some you mentioned Sir Francis Drake. So is your Panama work an Elizabethan thing? Is it a turn of the previous century with the building of the canal thing? Tell us a little bit about that.
It actually, there's two ideas. There is the Sir Francis Drake era and all that. It's amazing how many people were actually, involved in Panama, one way, form, fashion, or the other. I mean, in terms of how the West is concerned, Christopher Columbus on his 4th voyage first saw it, named the Caribbean side of the Isthmus, Portobello, beautiful port. And in the years to come, you'd have Sir Francis Drake would also die there, be buried at sea. Captain Henry Morgan, who the rum's named after, of course, he sacked 2 of their cities. And you had a variety of interesting individuals there. So I've thought of writing something about that era and have taken a lot of notes in my various trips there. But mine will be more modern and dealing with it now. Behind the United States, China, since you brought up China earlier, China is the 2nd biggest investor in Panama. And was even, as I understand, responsible for financing the 2 new canals that enter and exit from the large man-made lake in there, so that they're large tankers. And as one individual told me at a conference last fall, who's in the Navy, also aircraft carriers can go through because the old canal is much too small. And so it's been an interesting place for the last 500 years, and I don't think that's going to change in the future.
No, I expect not. Well, hey, I appreciate your presence. Thank you so much. Thanks again to our audience, and looking forward to the fall. Thanks again, Ed.
Oh, thank you, sir, for having me.
So long, everybody.